Hello and welcome to an essay plan that is going to compare the Emigree with London. This video will show you how to compare the two poems effectively. There's lots of videos that do a really good job of analysing each poem in isolation, which is important, but that is only step one. Step two is to compare the two poems, which means to write about their similarities and their differences. That is what the examiner wants. So this video will go through a number of sentence starters for a number of paragraphs, give you evidence to back each of these up, and importantly, link back to the key word in the question. If the paragraphs don't link back to the key word, then the question is not being answered. If the question is not being answered, you're not going to get the marks. Now, you can compare the Emigree with whatever poem you want. These poems were never meant to be compared, but as the question at the top is all to do with how the power of humankind against one's surroundings is portrayed in the Emigree and one other poem, I can really imagine comparing this to London. The idea of two poems which have two protagonists who have very strong emotional reactions, positive and negative, to the city in which they have come from and in one case still live. So what are the points that I would make in answer to this question, everybody? Well, first of all, whereas in the Emigree there is a real sense of freedom, this conflicts with the overbearing restraint of London. What's my evidence for this? Well, it's quite simple for the Emigree. I'm sure we'd all agree that the Emigree has a free-flowing enjambment and a lack of a consistent rhyme scheme. This suggests that the poet can go wherever they want, do whatever they want, think whatever they want, and to some extent now, perhaps, or perhaps to a little extent, say whatever they want. It suggests nostalgia, it suggests daydreaming, it suggests fond reminiscence. This is surely in complete contrast to the very rigid A-B rhyme scheme of London, where the first and the third line always rhyme, and the second and the fourth line always rhyme. The fact that we have 4 quatrains, a quatrain is a 4-line stanza, and we have 4 of them, again suggests a very rigid, templated structure to the poem, which surely reflects the lack of liberty, the restraint that we see running all the way through the poem of London. There is language that runs through this poem, such as chartered, such as manacles, which we could use here, but I'm going to save that for paragraph 2. What I would do here as well, because I'm slightly focusing more on structure than anything else here, is also just refer to the repetition in London. We have the repetition of chartered, which I think rather implies it being stamped into the mind of the reader, and we have the repetition of every in stanza 2. Again, rather implying that it's being stamped into the reader, that they're being perhaps indoctrinated. I touch upon this in the video where I compare London with checking out my history. And therefore a sense of being unable to go where you want, do what you want, think what you want, that we perhaps hopefully have more of in the Emigree. Sentence starter number 2, both poems claim that for society to try to impose itself onto the protagonists, this goes against the very laws of nature. What's my evidence for this? Well, we have first of all running through the poem of the Emigree a reference to sunlight. It comes at the end of stanza 1, it comes at the end of stanza 2, and it comes at the end of stanza 3. But we have a particularly unpleasant and quite violent verb in line 8, where we hear that we, or the protagonist, is branded by an impression of sunlight. So the idea of being branded by sunlight, this verb implies torture, it implies a painful modification, as it were, to somebody's body, and it's juxtaposed with this natural life-giving phenomenon that is sunlight, the sun. And so one's attempt to try and, as it were, impose oneself onto somebody else, and therefore because it's very often, I'm sorry to say, a tyrannical society that will be mostly engaging in torture of other people, there is an uncomfortable juxtaposition, there is an uncomfortable contrast that is presented between the two. The idea of something surely positive and life-generating, like the sun, being combined with the idea of it or somebody else branding somebody. This goes against the very laws of nature. It is an unpleasant thing to try and do, to try and control other people. And it goes against the laws of nature, branded, and the sun. The sun is a natural phenomenon, of course. I think this point perhaps comes across slightly more clearer when we try to compare it with London. When we hear of mind-forged manacles. We know by now, everybody, that manacles are handcuffs, and the fact that they are mind-forged, it gives us a more unpleasant metaphor, the idea that how these people think is somehow handcuffed, is somehow chained. They're unable to think for themselves and grow and express themselves in a mature way because they are constrained by society. So that clearly goes against the natural order of things. That clearly goes against nature. We also have the repetition of the adjective chartered. We should know by now that if the streets and the Thames are chartered, they are, as it were, mapped out and controlled by royal charters. The monarchy of the time are chartering, they are mapping out, and they are regulating who can go where and who can sail where and when according to what they want. So again, the fact that humankind and society is trying to control nature in this way, it's trying to control minds, it's trying to control the Thames, which again is another natural phenomenon. This surely goes against the very laws of nature. This is incongruous. This should not necessarily be tolerated. And point number 3 is ultimately I've noticed a contrast between daytime and nighttime in both poems. And I'm just going to try and compare the two of them in order to try and produce something that will help answer this question. So I notice how is the power of humankind against one's surroundings portrayed in the Emigree in one other poem. How can I use the idea of daytime or sunlight in the Emigree to do that? Well, I can suggest that because we have this structural thread of the sunlight that concludes each stanza, running through the whole of the Emigree, surely the protagonist is resisting her new city, the city of walls, that we hear about in the final stanza, by consistently linking her old city with the idea of sunlight. Because what is sunlight? As I've said, it is a life-generating, life-producing natural phenomenon that keeps us alive. And so that is how the protagonist is resisting its current city, the city of walls. And ultimately, I just want to compare it with the images of nighttime that we hear. We just have one reference in line 13 to the idea of midnight streets, but that's enough. The adjective midnight implies perhaps the witching hour. It implies when people can go and do what they want and not necessarily be caught doing so. And this is an unpleasant thing, and it would appear that much of the unpleasant scenes that Blake sees are all happening under the cover of darkness, where we do not have we do not have the sunlight, and therefore this is difficult for us. I think there's also something quite clever you can perhaps do with the poor chimney sweeper that we hear of in line 9. This is a chimney sweeper who, during the day, surely, when the chimney sweeper should be experiencing the sunlight, is, as it were, metaphorically contained within the midnight of the chimney, surrounded by the darkness, surrounded by the soot. If the chimney sweeper is up the chimney, that rather implies there is a blockage of some sort, so there is no sunlight coming down. And so the chimney sweeper, you could argue, consistently lives within the midnight world that Blake touches upon in his final stanza. That is therefore clearly, surely, a more explicit reference to how humankind tries to resist the power of the surroundings within which he or she is present. Point number 4 If the question is, how is the power of humankind against one's surroundings portrayed in the Emigree and one other poem? Point number 4, there is a sense of a personal connection with one's city in the Emigree, which is lacking in London. So again, this paragraph leads on the fact that in the Emigree, she has a conflict with the current city, the city of walls, by keeping a personal connection with the old city alive. And that, therefore, presents the contrast. So we hear about the old city, which takes me dancing. The use of the verb dancing clearly has connotations of fun, of excitement, of reckless abandon, perhaps. And we hear how the protagonist, I love its shining eyes. Clearly the use of the adjective shining. Okay, I have said in another video how that might have connotations of slight deception, but that doesn't necessarily support my point here, so I wouldn't mention that in this essay. I'd just say that the use of the verb the use of the adjective shining surely implies an ability to link to the idea of sunlight that runs all the way through the poem. And this imagery of sunlight that runs all the way through the poem is always complemented by 3 of the key senses. Line 8, I'm branded, touched by the sunlight. Line 16, I can't get it off my tongue, it tastes of sunlight. Line 30, my shadow falls as evidence of sunlight. I see evidence of sunlight. So what we're doing here, everybody, is that surely this is a very personal connection with the old city. The old city is associated with sunlight, and if she can, as it were, touch, taste, and see the sunlight, these 3 of the 5 senses that indicate we are living beings are so closely and so intimately connected with each other that it surely implies a very close combined personal connection, along with the idea of having, as it were, a very close, perhaps romantic relationship with the use of the verb dancing and the idea of being lost within the shining eyes. That, I suggest, shows power against the city of walls because it's keeping a powerful relationship alive. Wow, all of this positive stuff is surely therefore lacking in London, and this therefore more, again, explicitly answers the question. There is surely a power against the city of London in the poem that goes by the same name. How is this sort of conflict registered? Well, the fact that all the people that we hear of in London are nameless. We only hear about them because of their vocation. We hear of a chimney sweeper, we hear of a soldier, we hear of an infant and a man. Okay, those aren't necessarily vocations, but we don't still hear their name. We hear of a harlot. And this, therefore, suggests a complete and utter lack of personal connection with one's surroundings. We don't know their name. We don't know their backgrounds. Okay, we don't know the name of anybody in the Emigree, but there's clearly a far more closer personal connection in the Emigree that this nameless sense of absence that we get in London more clearly implies. We also have a slightly blunt, impersonal title, and this, I think, is actually a really good point, which perhaps one can develop a little bit more closely. The fact that the poem is just called London, it's blunt, it's impersonal, it's imprecise. This is, of course, a massive capital city that at the time it's written is one of, if not the, so to speak, centres of the world. There is a far more of a personalised connection in the title of the Emigree. We know that the Emigree, for example, is a female person with the use of that accent. We're just getting some sort of slightly clearer understanding of who the Emigree is in a way that we don't with the people in London. And final point, and this is just a reminder, everybody, you certainly don't need to use a finite amount of points. There are some here that you will gel with, some here that you won't. And here is one that perhaps you might gel with, or you might interact with in a positive or negative way. I'm sure that in the Emigree, a sense of childhood innocence runs almost entirely throughout. That starts off in the first line, there once was a country, ... which might remind us of childhood nursery rhymes of once upon a time, which sounds rather nice. We have images of sort of childish toys or childish items. Line 6, the idea of a bright filled paperweight. The idea of line 12, the child's vocabulary I carried here. The idea that they were once small and innocent and now they've taken that sense of innocence to their new city of the city of walls. A sense of childhood innocence that we get in the Emigree, which I'm sure we could contrast with London, where a far more bleaker, less innocent conflict with one's surroundings is portrayed. We hear of childhood in London. This is generally line 6, an infant crying, the poor old chimney sweeper in line 9, and indeed line 15, a newborn infant. So we get references to very young people in London, but you will have seen if you read the poem how all of them are generally operating or working in a world where the brutal reality of adulthood predominates. So a slightly weaker point there, as I read it out loud, perhaps one that you might use to complement a point or use as an introduction. Up to you. Hope it's been helpful. Bye for now.